to be an MPO under 200,000 in population. This may be reflective. The change that was being looked at may make sense in the world where you're looking at areas that are urbanized that are 1 million to 10 to 20 million people. But over in New England, we're looking at something very different as to how we function and what our cities are. I mean, our big cities are just about 30,000. I grew up in a suburb that is 50,000, so, that's a town, these are cities. It's a whole different world. And so how we work and how we function isn't quite the same. So we've been in business for 30 years next year. We have a model. We do every single thing that an MPO with 200,000 does. The only thing we don't do is there's a regulation that says when you go over 200,000, you do congestion management. We don't do that because we're not at that level. So it's the whole point that Steve made earlier is the scale. The scale of how we operate is being judged by one factor, which is population. It's not being judged by how effective we are. Population is the only measure of effectiveness and efficiency of an organization. And so my point is that we just need to look at this and figure out what it is that we need to say to people to show them that we have vitality, we have viability, and we're functioning and great things are happening because we know our region and we're able to function and get things done. I'm just repeating myself. I'm just frustrated. That's all. It's 30 years. We run a model. I'm upset. I have anything else to say.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Yep. So, RAD, I think we've been dealing with, we're the only one in the state in New Hampshire that would be affected by this 200,000. There's 4 MPOs and we're the only one, so we're in this on our own. I've mentioned it to all of our congressional delegation, and they're aware of this, and we're providing information to it, and I'm hopeful that when I meet on my non-billable hours next week in Dallas, I'll be able to talk to other small MPOs about this issue, because we're not the only one in the country that has this situation, and there's a lot of MPOs from the 1980s that have a significant role to play in their region, and this is just absurd. So now I'd just like to turn this over to talk about the issue with the under over 200,000 population and the 5307 FTA transit funds.
Brad.
So I think a lot of you have heard me talk about this before, so I'll try not to repeat too much, but the 5307 program is the urban public transit program, supports operations, capital, and planning. When you're in a UZA that's under 200,000, and we serve 3 UZAs at Coast, we serve Dover, Rochester, we serve Portsmouth, both of those are under 200,000. We also serve Boston in Exeter. Many of you don't realize Boston's in Exeter, but it is. In that case, the funds that we get through Boston can only be used for preventative maintenance or capital functions, which we use those dollars for. It'd be about $200,000, I think, in that out of Boston. Overall, our allocation is about $1.8 million a year right now. That does fluctuate by. It can fluctuate by a few $100,000 a year, which is not an insignificant amount of fluctuation. We use approximately $1 million of that 1.8 for operations every year. Why are we concerned about the population threshold of our UVAs when the census figures finally come out. When the UZAs that you, like Boston, go over 200,000 in population, you can no longer use your $5,307 to support your operation. Well, that's it would immediately create a $1 million gap for us in our $4.2 million budget. If somebody's got any grand ideas, I'd love to know how you fill that gap in this environment. So we are actively engaged right now working with our congressional representatives. We've had multiple meetings with them. We have another meeting with them on Tuesday next week to talk about legislative fixes with reauthorization. And what we're really shooting for is to move away from a population-based distribution mechanism and have it be based on the size of your active fleet at peak period, which is standard for our industry. So if you have fewer than 100 buses in peak revenue service, we're shooting to have as much flexibility as possible to use our federal 5307 funds however we see fit. Now, there's a debate going on around that and whether it's you have flexibility with 50% of the allocation, 75% of the allocation, 100% of the allocation, but we're working on kind of the perspective from New Hampshire that we want our congressional delegation to put forward. And at Coast, our goal is to have as much flexibility as possible so that we can solve our local problems, with our own local expertise on how to do that. This is something you'll hear more from on us. We hope that we can have the full support of the MPO behind us on the solution. And I think I'll leave it at that unless people have questions.
I just would like to add that the reason I brought up the New England city and town areas is because the new interpretation of an earmark is if you create legislation that provides an advantage to one party over another party, that is now an earmark. So if there's legislation proposed coming out of this, it has to be something that is inclusive and applies to every part of the country. And the reason why I'm focused on the New England city and town areas is maybe that is the vehicle that we can use in New England, which is an established by the Census Bureau as part of their national process and procedures, that this exists as part of the system, that maybe within New England city and town areas in the 6 New England states, there's a different parameter other than under over 200,000 population. If the 100 bus or something like that, the size of your bus system doesn't work, we can go to that New England, which is an established, recognized, it would not give any advantages to anyone, and therefore would not be an earmark.
The only challenge with that is that Nashua, who has an active public transit system, is not a separate New England city and town area from Boston. For whatever reason, it's not. There's not a separate designation. So between Coast, Manchester Transit Authority, Nashua Transit System, and CART and Salem Passau, or Salem Dairy, we have unique issues, and so we're all trying to work together to resolve this issue, but that is one unique issue that Nashua does not have an advantage on.
Ken?
Mr. Chair, those of us who've been involved with this for a long time, I think, understand the issues, but they are complicated. And I would like to take a stab at sort of keeping this all one syllable stuff. And if I can present what I think the issues are and make sure that I'm not simplifying it so much that it misrepresents. The issue on the federal level has to do with efficiency and effectiveness. That there are some places that have been identified that when you end up with overlapping MPOs or a lot of small MPOs, when a larger one could do it more efficiently and effectively, one of the ways of sort of forcing more efficiency is to say, get rid of the small ones, let it all happen in the big one. And what that would mean in New Hampshire, and maybe other New England communities, is that this area, which is under 200,000, decisions that we make here at this level around this table and recommendations would be made at the state level instead. Is that a?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the balancing things that we need to think about is there are advantages to efficiency and effectiveness. It costs less. It may move faster. But the cost is you're not as close to the people who are actually affected by it. And everybody may come down in a different place about where that balance is appropriate. But with respect to the Regional Planning Commission and the MPO things, I think that's sort of the balancing issue that we need to be thoughtful about. People need to understand that's kind of the trade-off of where you come out on that. With respect to the transportation piece of it, as I understand it, is if you were to take a community or a metropolitan area like Boston or New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, that the quantity of scale is such that the amount of flexibility in how you use funds is not as big a deal, because there's just more funds for everything. When you end up with a smaller entity like Coast or like the other transportation systems in New Hampshire, the budget is a whole lot smaller. We're probably, in a lot of ways, a lot leaner operations than those other operations. And when you start dictating, or when you start regulating whether funds can be used for capital or for operational on smaller systems, it has a much more significant impact. And so, in this particular case, if what might be a good idea as it applies to large systems is applied to a small system, it's like cost shifting. It says that if you are going to be providing the same level of service and you take away $1 million that can be used for helping to operate, the only place that $1 million now, if it's not going to come from the federal level, the only place it can come from is either from the state or from the local communities to keep the same level of service. And so again, it's an issue of a trade-off. There are some efficiency and effectiveness issues that apply, I think, probably fairly appropriately to big organizations that don't necessarily translate very effectively to smaller organizations. Is that a?
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
I'd just like to, getting back to the state revenue streams again, New Hampshire does not have the mechanism to provide transit funding for operations. And that's one of the issues that I think Brad's running into is this is all federal money, and one of the big issues is we don't have a cash match in New Hampshire to provide funding for these operations, and it's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to face soon, that figuring out how to do that, especially if these things come to pass with the 5307 and the MPO issues. Another instance is New Hampshire DOT does not have a working transportation model right now for doing I believe, for doing air quality, and if we were to go away, somebody has to do that now, and that's a big cost for the state to get that transportation model up and running. I understand, at least updated to the point where it's functional for what we need it for. So,
Thank you. Any other discussion, or any other comments?
Only comment is just to echo what Cynthia said. This is not a minor issue. This is not a footnote or a paperwork issue or where is an office here or there. This is this would be a radical change for this region. At best, maybe it would go back to something where there was a larger Seacoast MPO, which is Rocky and Strafford, but probably not. And that's a big shift, and it's somewhat disappointing that we're seeing this potential unraveling of all the good work that's been
As you're aware, this is a discussion item, and I believe that